Hello, everyone. A big thank you for all of you who's joining us today to discuss the topic of exploring systems change for a post-COVID world. My name is Bowen Feng, the community developer at Systems Innovation. And as co-hosts of this session, we have Nancy, Jeff, and David, all members of the brand new SI Hub, Systems Innovation Hub in New York, of which this will be their first launch event. So it's a big day for them and very excited to see how the hub evolves going forwards. So today we're very fortunate to be joined by Rob Ricigliano. Rob has constantly been exploring how to use systems and complexity thinking in accessible and practical ways. He's currently a systems and complexity coach to a variety of philanthropic organizations and supports teams that aim to drive deep impact in the complex environments in which they work. He's the author of Making Peace Last, a toolbox for sustainable peace building, is an emeritus board member on the Alliance for Peace Building, and has partnered with leaders around the world to help resolve conflict. He's also served as an adjunct professor and co-director of the Master of Sustainable Peace Building program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and a non-resident fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of Johns Hopkins University. He's a graduate of Hamilton College and Harvard Law School, and is passionate about tackling seemingly intractable challenges through the power of systems thinking. So it's a great pleasure that you're able to join us today, Rob, and thanks a lot for taking the time.
Great, thanks for having me. I appreciate this community and all the work you've done to pull this together, and all the people on the line here, I'm sure, have done in their areas to push this whole challenge of systems change forward. And I think to say a systems change is a team sport is a way understatement. So it takes a system to change a system. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're all in quite good company today. I mean, we have lots of people here who, whether they're fairly new to systems thinking and really kind of want to see what it might mean in practice, how it relates to some, topics that we're facing today, or people that have been doing it for years. I mean, we really have a widespread. So I think it's always great to kind of bring this community together. I'd just like to say that before I pass over to Rob, that we're really keen to make this an interactive session today. So for those of us joining us on Zoom, feel free to post any thoughts or questions you have, as we're discussing, directly in the chat, and we'll be monitoring those and surfacing them for Rob throughout the session. And for those joining on YouTube as well, likewise, if you post any thoughts or comments on the chat in the live stream, we'll aim to have a look at those as well. And before I pass on to Rob, I'd just like to say as well that I think, this topic which we're talking about today is really an important one, because, we've all, experienced a string of very crazy events over this past year, as we all know. And I think for many of us, it's been a bit of a wake-up call. And there's been certain themes that have really come to kind of the forefront that we can no longer kind of be oblivious to. And, one of which, of course, is how interconnected and how interdependent we all are. And also how one issue, for example, that can crop up in one place might not only have big repercussions, in many other places in the world, but also in many different contexts that we would simply not have imagined. And so I think it's a great pleasure to be discussing this topic today, very much looking forward to it. And so on that note, Rob, I'll pass over to you to initiate today's conversation.
And Bon, I've got some slides that I've just kind of used to want to use to kind of anchor some of the discussion, and I've kind of broken it up into 3 parts. And if you want to just do like one part at a time, we can do discussion at any point. I was trained early on in my career in law school that if you're doing an oral argument and the judge doesn't ask any questions, you're not doing well. So I really like questions for lots of reasons. So let me share my screen, and I'll just sort of dive in on this concept. Where are we? I don't want to start with the last slide. So let me, so first of all, I assume, Bowen, you can all see that. Is that correct?
It's just loading for me, I think. I don't see it quite yet.
I'll try again. Let me try again.
Okay.
It seemed like it was not sharing the right screen. How's that?
It's just loading now. Great, I can see it. Thanks.
Okay. All right, good. Yeah, I'm taking up this general question of what can a complex systems approach tell us about rebuilding communities in the wake of COVID? I hesitate to say a post-COVID world because I understand we're never going to ever be in a post-COVID world. So there's some approximation of that that's going to happen, I think. And then there's there's a million points you could make here, and there's 3 key points that I want to talk about. And I'm happy to talk about the deeper conceptual roots or practical implications of any of these things, but I kind of structured it more on the couple key implications and a few key insights and a few key implications of those insights. So just I'll go over the 3 first, and I want to dig into the first one. So first, this for me is a sort of a general principle that's just a good practice, and certainly applies to working in communities post-COVID, which is to see across the complexity spectrum. And I'll talk about how I define what that spectrum is. But effectively, it's a way to align whatever we need to do in the short term with whatever needs to happen or we would like to do or accomplish in the long term. Whatever happens sort of in the immediate urgent and what needs to happen in the long-term sort of systemic. Second is kind of more of a positive spin on this, which is that rebuilding communities doesn't mean we go back to the status quo. I think there's a huge opportunity here that the disruption caused by COVID present opportunities for deeper systems change that really only appear in these moments of significant disruption, which don't happen all that many times in our lifetime. And this is one of them. And then the point I think that is the one that has the deepest implications for each of us individually, and certainly for the teams and the organizations and the communities we work in, is that the entrenched patterns of inequity that exist in the communities we would want to work in and exist in the society that we live in are going to co-opt any system change effort. They will be there. They will act in ways that are much more powerful than what any one of us can do. So we need to really center a deep understanding of how those patterns of inequity show up within each of us and then show up in the teams and the structures that we're a part of. And that one, I think, we could talk for hours about that one and days or months, but I think it's really important to note that and want to make sure we spend time to dig into that more. Let me take up on the first point, Bowen, if that feels okay, which is just generally to sort of talk about some general vocabulary here, which I think some people may know well, other people may be new to, but effectively, this is the distinction between clock problems and cloud problems, or the complicated world or in the complex world in the kind of Cynefin framework complexity sense. But it's a foundational sort of distinction, right? And really important to hold with us at all times. And in the work that I do, this is the one that is the mental model shift that has the biggest implications, I think, especially for foundations. And we label the middle part the murky middle because, the world doesn't come pre-labeled complicated or complex or clock or cloud. It's just oftentimes it's murky. The tool that we use a lot, that I use a lot, is to identify distinctly different approaches along what I would say is a spectrum. There's a lot of conceptual debate about whether this is a continuum or not. There's a gap in the middle of there because it's basically suggesting that clock problems don't just migrate into cloud problems. But there's a fundamental sort of difference of time between the two, and at some point there's a tip. But what this is basically saying is that any complex challenge has these 4 dimensions to it, or is susceptible to these 4 different approaches. It probably needs these 4 different approaches at any time. So the one end of the spectrum, the clock end of the spectrum, is this idea of targeted solutions, that there are urgent, localized, time-bound needs. So in this case, you'll have communities that are hurting badly to the point that they cannot function. They can't even think beyond the next week or month if those needs aren't addressed. And it doesn't do any good to come into that community and say, hey, we're going to talk about long-term system change. I know you're really hurting now, but let's put that off to the side. Like, people can't do that, right? So there's a degree to which you have to be sensitive to what are those really hurting, urgent needs and that require targeted solutions. As we move a little further out toward the cloud side, are what we would label solutions at scale, which are meeting the needs of a wide swath of people. It's a need that's shared by a lot of people, and you can address that need in a at scale, sustained way. So oftentimes this is a sort of technological solution that allows multiple people to have access to financial services that never had access to that before, or to core benefits that they are eligible for but have a hard time applying for. Policy changes. There are a lot of things that are in the solution at scale category, and I think a lot of what we tend to think of as systems change is, in my vocabulary, more of solution at scale change, because it doesn't ultimately deal with the underlying dynamics in the system that are producing the symptoms and the problems that we care about. And that's what the right side of the spectrum is about. So label these two systems innovation, which is you're working in the system to change a key pattern in that system, whether that's to disrupt a problematic one that's causing pain and causing problems, or keeping the problem stuck in place, or you're amplifying a positive one that's a bright spot that will free up a lot more sort of creativity, energy, and change in the system. The systems transformation is, for me, the deep end of the pool. This is where you're not really focused on one particular pattern or dynamic, but you're actually committing to improve the health of the system by affecting what is a web of underlying interconnected patterns. So this is sort of highest on the scale of complexity, hardest to understand, murkiest system. And I use the word commit to because your agency at this level is much less than you probably would want it to be. You can control committing to do that. The system is the one who's in control of actually doing it. And those closer and proximate and a much larger scale in the system are the ones who are going to do that. So the important thing is these all exist. The danger is to go down any one of these paths, ignoring the other ones. So you can do systems innovation work at the expense of meeting and addressing urgent needs, right? So you have to take that into account. You want to address urgent needs in a way that you hope doesn't prejudice any larger scale type change work, especially systems change work. You can meet urgent needs in a way that actually entrenches dynamics that disempower, especially BIPOC communities, that entrench power relationships that have produced the problems to begin with, but are in the short term necessary to alleviate a symptom of the problem. And you don't want to do that in a way that makes it harder to change the underlying problematic pattern at some point. So for me, the implications around this is that our sort of what's incumbent on us is wherever we're engaging, whether it's at a solution at scale or systems transformation, is to be conscious of the spectrum, and to know, and to both because you want to be sure you're not missing an opportunity or a need. You're not doing the systems transformation work at a time when people can't get beyond kind of an urgent need that they have. It also keeps us from over-investing in any one part of the spectrum. So you can do a lot of solution at scale work that is like aimed at poverty alleviation, but if you're not actually undoing the underlying structure that produces poverty, it gets to be problematic. There was a colleague of mine did a lot of interviewing in the development work, and they're looking at poverty alleviation programs, and one of the beneficiaries said to the groups that I think the development community is just trying to make my poverty more palatable. So you can take that word poverty and say my inequity, my repression, more palatable. And that's, if you're not actually engaging at the system side of the scale, you may fall into that moral hazard. And a lot of the systems work shouldn't be done you might not need it. Like you actually might get farther and a better use of resource if you're engaging in a solution at scale. So it's just keeping looking across, right? And where you engage is a more of a strategic, tactical decision about what you're going to do. It's just don't ignore the rest. And also the thing that is very present for the various philanthropies that I work with, they have different missions and different capacities, different networks, and so they have to know that the kinds of organizational structures and practices, cultures that make you really good at targeted solutions, for example, are very, very different from the ones that will make you good at systems transformation. So the idea of a technical type strategy where we have to be very efficient at getting from point A to point B will work in a targeted solution context, will not work in a systems transformation context. And that's where we're talking about much more emergent practices. And I would say emergent organizational structures and network structures, which are needed to do that. You can't sustain the systems transformation effort unless you have that supporting, enabling organizational and network structure behind it. So they just take very different practices. And again, a lot of really great work is undermined because people don't fully appreciate that. And I probably spend most of my time helping organizations who want to be playing at the systems innovation or transformation level, understanding how they have to change as organizations and in their practices and in their mental models in order to do that. So I'm going to stop there, Bowen, and just say that happy to talk about any questions for this, both in general or more specifically about dealing with communities and dealing with the recoveries from COVID.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks a lot for that provocative kind of intro, Rob. And I'd love to pass to the other hosts as well to kind of surface any questions or continue the discussion. But I guess just one thing that really stood out for me there, and is something that I have to keep reminding myself, is that when you first kind of stumble into these ideas behind systems thinking and systems change, it's very easy to kind of look at it and be like, almost as a bit of a silver bullet, like everything I was doing in the past in maybe more of a linear kind of way, that's all wrong, and this is the way. And I mean, it's really taking more of a nuanced view and looking at what's in front of you. And let's say you're in a corporation, and some things don't need such a complexity lens. You can take more of a linear approach, but really just assessing the situation and responding accordingly. So yeah, thanks for that. But yeah, I'd love to pass on to Nancy. Feel free to.
Sure. Well, thank you, Rob. One question that we might have is, if a company is really thinking that they're in sort of the complex end of the spectrum, systems transformation, systems innovation, but in fact, they are still dealing with the complicated end. What advice do you have for the companies, or do you have a checklist that you go through to guide them through the thinking of where they are on the spectrum?
Yeah, a great question. And yeah, so both, my pause is sort of like, you're activating all the emotional memories I have of dealing with that question over the last 6 years. I would say a couple key things. One is to make the conversation shared and transparent, and kind of like where you were saying, Bowen, is not to assume that you should magically be in one part of this, have one set of capabilities that you weren't built to do, that are new and different. And when we're talking about the systems innovation transformation capacities that you need, those are both new for many organizations. They're also, I would say, we've not figured that part out yet, right? So like, it's also not like, there's not like a playbook on that. So there's not quite a checklist, I think. I think there's some key things about it. But it has to be, you're never going to get there unless it's a explicit conscious conversation, and you can talk about the ways in which people in your organization may not want to go there. So where you should be and where you can be are different questions, and And so you may have the aspiration to be someplace that you're not, but it doesn't make it easy to get there. So that leads me to my sort of second point, which is the part I didn't put in here that is the most difficult part, is that the organizational transition process, or adding a capacity into the organization to deal with systems work, is itself a complex systems change effort. So in other words, it is a fractal of what you're trying to do externally. And so what's worked in the organizations that I work in has been a couple of things. One is look for the bright spots, or look for even they're not bright spots yet, but that are kind of ready to emerge spots. So I would work with a program team that was ready for this, that was ready to do a strategy refresh, that was open to this, had some understanding of the concepts, was not totally stuck in their ways, was not their biggest program, was not their smallest program in the organization. And we created what we call kind of an innovation pocket within the organization. And it was an experiment. And we knew we were not going to get it right. And that was kind of the point, that what we didn't get right, we would learn from, and what we did get right, we would try to hold on to and improve. So having these kind of innovation pockets, starting small, starting tangible, and prioritizing learning, I think, is critical. The other one, there are some key differences, right? So how you measure success is really important. I was actually listening to talk from Dave Snowden this morning, who many might know from the Cynefin framework, but and I really liked his notion of this kind of vectoral theory of change, which is, so as opposed to an outcome-based theory of change. So an outcome-based theory of change is that we're trying to hit certain points, and if we hit them, we've succeeded. If not, we haven't. And his was, we need measures that basically say, have we affected the vector? And that's how systems change goes, right? So that's a very core identity issue, mental model issue, and practical process issue. And some of the foundations I worked in, it was also down to incentives. People were incented based on how many grants they gave out versus what those grants went for, and whether that was the right call or strategic. Anyway, so I think those are a few points about making that transition. Again, it's one of those ones that the key is being overt, conscious, and shared in the conversation.
Mm-hmm. And that makes a lot of sense. One question that's coming from the audience here is a little bit related to that, is having that shared conversation, but then how do you analyze the complexity of the system to understand its needs? So you're having the conversation, but then what conversations are you having, or what analysis are you doing to see what the needs are?
Yeah, again, this is kind of an emergent ability, but there are lots of really kind of concrete places that you can start. And there are lots of, what's really great now, I think, as opposed to 5 or 6 years ago, is there are a lot of tried practices and tools for doing that. So everything from, you can take kind of a futures or foresight kind of set of tools that make you look at current signals and projecting into the future as to where they want to go. What are the signals in your current environment? And there are frameworks for how you sort of sort those out and make sense of those signals. We invested a lot early on, or I've used early on the tool of kind of understanding dynamics. So take what you're seeing in a problem set and asking why. Like, so what are the patterns of behavior? What are the recurrent stories people are telling that are holding this problem in place, or are keys to changing that at a deeper level? So whether that's dynamic systems mapping or even just kind of archetype analysis, you look at kind of very recurrent archetypes. David Stroh's book is really strong on this, Systems Thinking for Social Change. David is a master practitioner at, I would call, systems innovation work as well as transformation, but he's really good at the systems innovation stuff. We focus on a couple key patterns. There are a variety of tools out there to start to understand the complexity of a system. There are some also basic indicators, like, so what's the degree of agreement about what even the problem is? Does it generate a lot of conflict? Do proven remedies in one context or in one community not work in another community when they should? We sort of talked about a few things. If you notice, like Groundhog Day, which is you're living the same problem over and over again, even when you think you solved it. Sign of complexity. Whack-a-mole. So you hit one problem and another problem pops up, and you hit that problem and another problem pops up. If you know that game, that carnival game. Another sign of complexity. And the other one we talked about is opposite day, which is the stuff that should have worked and not only didn't work, it actually had the opposite, had a negative impact, right? So if you start to see those kinds of things, those are all signs of complexity in your world. And that should argue, if you see those things, that we need to dig deeper into what's going on. If many people know the iceberg diagram around systems, where events are above the water, but then you have sort of structures and behavior structures, mental models below this. So that sign of complexity is, I mean, you have to start digging down into that. What are those things? And in our case, or in my case, I find looking for patterns and identifying, articulating those patterns, and then learning from those patterns is really a really helpful tool.
That's extremely helpful. And then this next question, I like how they're sort of in succession and related to each other, is are there any signs or patterns or things that you look at in a financing system? So accountability across the financial system.
I'm having relived trauma. So this is what I work on. The problem is that a lot of issues just are a lot of the financing and certainly philanthropy is set up is to value particular types of impacts that are kind of the tail wagging the dog. So if you're looking for short-term impacts that you can draw attribution to, we did X and it produced Y, that model will push you out of the systems change complex part of that spectrum and into the clock side, even if you want to be in the complex side, right? So the way that financing works often is very short-term, very concrete, outcome based. There's been a tremendous amount of really good work on what better types of indicators there are out there that will actually help you stay and be effective in the systems change realm. But I think the philanthropic world certainly is short on that. In some ways, the venture capital world is more open to that. I say in some ways, because they tend to be people who are willing to take a lot of risk, tolerate a lot of uncertainty, think in long term, and you have also a tendency in that world also to actually be very outcomes impact focused, concrete impact focused. So the biggest sort of gap I find with folks who are in that world is they want to say that they'll measure return. When they look at rate of return, they'll measure return based on social return. I think that their indicators of social return are way inadequate to actually get them where they want to go, because it tends to be short term. They tend to look at numbers of lives touched, depth of lives touched. Those are a bit too simplistic for very early, certainly the early stages of a systems change effort, where those numbers are going to look bad on both sides, but actually you might be onto something that could be very, very effective. And because people know the J curve of change, which is the change looks very, very minimal for a significant period of time, hits an inflection point and goes up. A lot of venture capital and a lot of traditional philanthropy gets stuck, doesn't get out of the flat part of that curve, right? Because they don't get the impacts they need to go forward. It was more depressing than it was hopeful. I guess the one hopeful thing I'll say is there is much more a conversation. I had 2 this week. I had several last week. In the philanthropic world, in the system case financing world, to change what's happening at a bigger scale, because there are lots of bright spots of change. who are not doing the kind of things I say we should avoid, and are doing, I think, positive things on the systems change side. We just need to grow that. And there's a lot of conversations about doing that right now, which is really good.
Okay, perfect. I think David has a question that he'd like to ask from the audience or from himself. David?
Sorry, I just enabled the setting that people could unmute themselves. So I think, David, you should be able to do that now.
Thank you, Rowan.
It had a very unusual message. The host is not allowed to unmute himself. And I was like, wow, that's okay. So, Rob, regarding, first of all, hello, thank you very much. Really great stuff. Regarding your diagram of the spectrum or the continuum, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, and maybe it's the question is not the right premise, but does, and if so, when a solution at scale, in fact, become, whether by design or not, essentially a systems intervention, systems change?
Yeah, I think certainly that is certainly can happen, and I would say solutions at scale have a natural sort of tendency to have more systemic impact, because when you in a sense, you could think of them as, if they're successful solutions at scale, they are being disruptive in a positive way, right? And out of that disruption can help tip a system through a phase. Actually, it's one of the next things I want to talk about is that sort of cycle of systems, sort of life cycle. So it can. I would say the key is we shouldn't just sort of take it on faith that it will happen. And that by having a deep systems understanding is going to maximize the chances that our solutions at scale will migrate. Like if you have a theory for how that might in fact happen, it's helpful. I've worked with an organization that is a solutions at scale organization. That's what they do, and they do it really well. But we did some dynamic systems mapping with them, and they said, we're not going to do the systems change stuff, but that was really helpful because we now know we're going to engage here, what we think here in the system, and we're going to monitor to see whether what we do has, if we see some of these other dynamics that are worsening or having a negative impact, it's going to help us monitor for that to make sure we're not doing harm. And we think if our solution scale is successful, it's going to interrupt this dynamic over here. And we will look for signs that it has been disrupted. And if it has, is it having positive impacts on the rest of the system, right? So that's a kind of an outcome harvesting type approach. So the key thing is just doing it consciously. Like, so it's, for this particular organization, it was exactly the right choice to go for solutions at scale. Complex problem, and maybe the solution at scale wasn't going to work, but it was a good choice to make as long as they monitored for positive and negative interfaces between the system side and their solution scale side.
Thank you.
Great.
All right, and Rob, did you want to continue with some slides, or shall I?
This next one's pretty short,
okay, sure.
And it picks up a little bit on. It's relevant to David's question, I think. Let me just pop this back up. So this, many of you may know the adaptive cycle. I've kind of repurposed it as the systems life cycle. And people have different labels for those four phases, but effectively it's, and this comes, I think, originally from environmental science and ecology, but that a system at some point is just kind of chaotic, it's disrupted. You start to get reorganization, species form, those species thrive, they start to grow and flourish in an ecosystem. At some point, they tip from growing, they're not growing anymore, they're maintaining, and then at some point that maintenance tips into decay, which gets you back into disruption. But the key thing here is that there's parts of every system that are in probably each of these four phases, and there's usually a dominant sort of character of a system. Is it growing? Is it reorganizing? Is it in the midst of disruption? Is it kind of in that maintenance phase? I did some work with a team that was working on local journalism and journalist ecosystems, local ecosystems, and basically said they are extremely disrupted. We did this work like 4 years ago. It's probably still that way, but they basically said, we might actually be able to have some leverage on the system if we help that disruption form into reorganization. We're gonna sort of focus on how do we help experiment with different models of media ecosystems that are financially sustainable for those in them. And they just did a bunch of experiments that way around different parts of the U.S. And so that was an example of trying to tip a system from a dominantly disrupted phase to a more starting into some sort of productive reorganization. And so in communities, I think it's a question of saying, well, what's wanting to emerge in this community? What is it? What maybe could have been happening or people wanted to happen pre-COVID that because we've had the disruption of COVID now is actually more possible to do? And there's almost a bit of leapfrogging you can do here. So something could have been stuck, a community could have been stuck in maintenance and decay. And some certain forces keep it from being disrupted because there's a vested interest in not having that disruption. But they might actually just be able to leapfrog into reorganization because they've had this intense, very focused disruption. And can we capture the and really start to supercharge those? So what in the philanthropic world, an example is around after, in the early weeks and months of COVID, a lot of philanthropies rewrote grant agreements to say, this is general operating funds now. Forget the specific, deliverables you had to do. We're converting all those into general operating funds because we think you're much closer to the ground. You know how this money needs to be spent, and it may be way outside what we originally thought this money should be spent for. And so what's interesting now is a lot of philanthropies are saying, why go back to the other model? Like, we're kind of made this general operating thing work. Can we fine tune that? Can we scale that in a way that actually would change how we give? And so I think that's a key one, I think, for a lot of communities. And the big piece on that next phase about inequity and the patterns that drive inequity, key one there is power. Who has power? Who has power? Who has control of resources? And I would say that is one of the key opportunities potentially, that if that's already been disrupted, can we keep the entrenched power interests from pulling that power back and keeping that power vested in the community? What structures, what processes can we put in place to do that? Anyway, that's what I wanted to say in this phase.
And so thank you for that. When you see the infinity sign there and going around, do you align any of those phases back to the complexity spectrum at all? Or does this infinity circle sit on the side of systems innovation and systems transformation?
I don't think there's any one phase is sort of more dominant in a sense. I would say there is a key, though, point of when you're in a disrupted phase. So I was talking to a group who was dealing with racial equity, and just we were talking about this frustration of we were in this kind of like step forward, 2 steps back. We still have the same really like the symptoms of the killings of Black men and women by white police officers in the U.S. Over and over. And one of my diagnoses for that is that if disruption is not channeled into reorganization, and that channeling might take not a solution at scale even, it might take a systems innovation or transformation. And because that stuff's more difficult, it means that we haven't really effectively ever gone from disruption into reorganization. We've kind of go from disruption back into maintenance. So we're going back to status quo. And so I'd say, Nancy, in response to your question, I would say that there are certain points in that where some are more relevant. And I think that's the key one.
All right, thank you. One of the questions we have here is, which organizations are typical early adopters of SI best practices, public, private, and why?
Yeah, I was talking about that earlier this week in the philanthropic world, and this was a person I was talking with said that they really felt that the foundations that have basically a living single donor tend to be a bit more like your angel investor that might come out at an earlier stage in the development of a technology. Whereas you have your institutional investors, which are like USAID, or those kind of maybe the older, sort of harder to change foundations. Yeah, I think that there are. I mean, I'm very fortunate to work with one of those, and with a donor who's very who funds a range of organizations, but is very risk tolerant, very complexity aware, and tolerant of experimenting, and knowing that if you're dealing with these hard, complex problems, you're going to fail more than you're going to succeed. So that kind of donor, or that kind of financer, is who's suited to be at that cutting edge of the systems innovation or systems transformation work, who's built for that flat part of the J change curve, who can live in that flat part and see the subtle signals that they are being effective, or that they're not being effective. So it really takes folks who are really open to that, not just risk tolerant, but attuned to what are the right signals. What are the signals that will tell you you're being a good steward of your resources, or a good implementer of, or executor of whatever strategy that you've put in place. So yeah, I think there are definitely those folks, and so again, I think those folks are both in existence as philanthropists, but also as investors. But again, it's a particular subset of both of those communities that have those characteristics.
There's something that people are wondering, Rob, is the place of experts in a complex system and being able to do complex change, and we have seen through the COVID that many experts disagree about what to do and how to do, and clearly the public is a bit at lost here. So what is your take on why is expertise useful, and to which point, basically?
So I think you guys were briefed on what questions were going to make little parts of my brain go, I confronted that a lot. So it's a really interesting question, Jeff, because we're in the systems change world, you need expertise. We're not saying that, like people were thinking, I was saying to a lot of the organizations I work with, are you saying expertise no longer matters? And I just say, no, it matters a lot. It's just first and foremost, whose expertise, and how is that expertise connected to decision making? So in the whose expertise thing, I might be trying to improve community health indicators in a particular community, and I might be really expert on the kinds of things that will, from a scientific standpoint, that will do that. The experts at dealing with the complexity of the community and what would help that community move to that model is not me. It's the community. So that's where I have to look to the community to provide that expertise. And if there's not like one person who's got like, I'm a community expert on health issues, because there's usually not that, they don't have a sign outside their house that does that. It's incumbent on me to sort of, how do I hold the space? How do I create the space where those people can come forward, or that community that will give voice to the community if they don't have that voice. So it's about what expertise and how, and substantive expertise, technical expertise. We have to put that alongside of sort of relational expertise, social network expertise, expertise in kind of just the community life, and the deeper patterns that exist in a particular community. So the other thing that we wrestled with that was difficult was what we call the expert model, which was in something in the philanthropic world, which was, look, I know this field. Your job is to give me money. I will spend the money, and I'll tell you what we did with it. But and like we started at the beginning, if systems change work requires this level of shared consciousness across very diverse actors in an ecosystem, and so for the expert model tends to mean I can concentrate that expertise in a person or a small team. Systems change requires that kind of shared consciousness where we each have a piece of this puzzle in our heads, and the power is bringing that together, is harnessing that collective intelligence. And that's where the other piece we have to be careful that our expertise, which tells us what we think the right answer is, it doesn't mean that I can be the hero and go in and implement that, because it won't work that way. Lots more to go on that question, yeah, but I'll leave it there.
All right, we're going to combine a couple of questions here. First, if you don't have control over the levels of the complexity spectrum, how does an organization, are there typical triggers that would lead an organization to engage in a systems innovation, systems transformation initiative? And if an organization decides not to go there, is there a sustainability risk for that company long term?
Yeah, I think that so we would take the position, or we take the position with the organizations that we work with, so there's not a place to be. And some of them have actually multiple places. Like they've made a very conscious decision to say, we're going to try to play across the spectrum as the situations that we're engaged in, the systems we're engaged in kind of demand. It's a perfectly respectable choice. It's also a difficult choice from a organizational capacity question standpoint. The three things that we would ask people to look at is the first to say, what does your mission and values tell you? So that's something you define, right, as an organization. Where do we want to be? What do we care about? What makes us want to get up in the morning? What are the values we want to be about in this world? Second is, what's your context telling you? So what are the opportunities? I mean, is this context just so dominated by sort of urgent needs and the need for targeted solutions that we might want to play in the systems change realm, but that's really, it's not our time. And this is not our place. So what is the context telling you? And then the third one is, what are your capacities? So like I mentioned, the solution at scale organization, they were built to do that, and they did it really well. And they might aspire to some of the more complex system type outcomes or changes, but they knew they didn't have that capacity, and it wasn't the best use of their resource at that moment to develop that capacity at the expense of fine tuning their solution at scale work. So I think that was a great choice, a very conscious choice that was looking at least at those three variables: capacities, context, and mission and values. So I think that's the heart of it for me, is where do you come out on that? I think then, are you at risk? So one of the things we have to counter is everyone should be doing systems transformation work. And if you're not doing good work. That's bullshit. I think if you only do it, or if you do one and you claim to do the other one, that's problematic. The important thing is just to be honest about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and communicate that with folks. So just to be very transparent about it. Some of the foundations that I work with, when they began making them change to more systems change type capacities, did outreach to their community and said, here's what we're trying to do. This is our sort of mental model of why we're doing this and what we're going to do. We know we're not going to get it right, and we know it's going to impact lots of you folks who've been our grantees and investees. But we want to just be open about that and transparent about that, and at least tell you what our aspiration is, and just not hide this and have it be a surprise to anybody. And for those of you that want to join us in this, we would love to have that conversation with you. It's not without pain at times, it's not without risk, certainly. The important thing is to be transparent and be true to who you are, and who you are and who you might be, but do it with a sober kind of perspective.
Because there's a related one here where I'm just going to read it outright because I think it relates to what you were just saying. I sense that some organizations or communities may highlight targeted solutions as the solution. Food is the solution to hunger, homes is the solution to homelessness, but our systems keep creating these patterns while we're busy solving for individual level of distress. It feels extremely challenging to talk about systems when there is so much need and focus on immediate, urgent needs. How to find balance. And I think that's what you were trying to convey, is that there is a balance amongst each of those phases.
I think that's the big piece is that I mean, the foundation of kind of systems thinking is that if you change your perspective, you change your behavior. You know, in other words, if you step back, there's a great definition of systems thinking as systems thinking stands back just far enough to deliberately blur discrete events into patterns of behavior. So that changing of perspective changes your sense of what is reality and how you can best respond to that reality. So I think that there's a degree to which when people are very focused on urgent needs is not to be judgmental and say you shouldn't do that because that's kind of not right? So they do need to be addressed. The question is, so if you could take a moment, step back and see that urgent need, that discrete event, that crisis even, in a much larger concept. So wow, when I step back, I see that crisis has emerged every 5 years for the last 50 years. Okay, maybe there's an urgent need of a different kind here, which is to actually affect what's happening at the systems level because we just haven't attended to that. And if we don't, the problem's going to continue to come up. I think there are allies in any of these communities, I think, who will identify with the different positions around from the systemic to the very urgent. And we sort of have to privilege those parts of the conversation, make sure those voices are in the system. Yeah, so I have a lot of examples of foundations. The community that was focused on racial equity programs had an evaluation done of their racial equity programs. And basically, the people came back and said, "Look, one of your grantees said they think the funders are teaching us to lie to you because you don't actually want to know what it's going to take to do the systemic work. You just want to know you did something positive in the short term." And so so if you actually cared about the systems change work, you should know that you're actually part of the system that's keeping the problems stuck where they are. And you know, you're not going to change everybody's mind with that. But it's a useful. For me, it's the most useful way to go about it. Is can we shift that perspective long enough for people to see the systemic level, and even if they choose not to be there, at least they're now making a choice to not do that. Versus it's a bit of a cop out to say it's only about the urgent, because it's not only about this.
Rob, do you have we're short on time here, so did you have a couple more slides?
Let me just show one more slide. This is I would feel remiss if I didn't. So it's really this about if both BIPOC communities and BIPOC people who are in, let's say, not dominant BIPOC communities are disproportionately hit by COVID, we can't address the sort of rebuilding question unless we center equity in that work. And that means everywhere down from understanding how it's affecting how you show up, how your team shows up, how your org shows up. These key questions about who has power, who makes decisions, who controls resources, what's my role? I can't see myself as the hero here. That doesn't work. How do I really support systems change from within the system? Because it's that system that needs to do it. And one of the CEOs that I work with said that she thinks about their foundation's work as really power shifting. They have power because they have resources. Their job is to shift that power outside of their organization to the people who need the power. And I think that means disrupting a lot of these socioeconomic patterns. I know that is saying a tremendous amount in like a minute, but I would feel remiss if I didn't say it. And if people don't know the monograph "Systems Change and Deep Equity" by it's an interview with Cheryl Petty and Mark Leach. I can follow up Nancy. I can give you the slides if you want afterwards. But I think that if you wanted one resource to read, I would say that's a must read. It treats this question really, really thoroughly, wherever you're at in your sort of journey into equity.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Rob, and thanks everybody for chipping in the questions. And it's really bittersweet for me to be trying to draw this to a close, because that was it was so rich, and we touched on lots of different topics. But one thing, Rob, as well, that I really kind of respect about what you do, and how you've been kind of communicating systems change and the work that you do, is that it's very much around the peace building, the philanthropy. And it reminds me of, I think it was Peter Drucker who once said, like, it's better to do the right thing wrong than the wrong thing right. And I think when we look around these days, there's so much, there's a lot of places that need support and help. And so, thanks for sharing us your learnings, Rob. It's really a pleasure. And did you have any last thoughts or concluding words you wanted to share before?
I mean, I like your quote, Bones. I think that's the thing, is that we need to have compassion, not just with people we work with, but for ourselves. I work with a board member who says that when teams come to the board to pitch a strategy to get funding, she said their job is not to convince us they got it right, because we know they got it wrong. Their job is to convince us they can get it better. So we need to be focused on, how do we get better? What's the next right thing to do? And I think that's the way to not get lost in the complexity while you're trying to deal with complexity.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Rob. And I guess on a last piece, I know, Rob, you have a hard stop on the hour mark, so if you need to drop off, that's totally fine. But I'd love to just pass over to David as well, just to take the floor for the last few minutes to share a bit more about the New York SI Hub. So yeah,
I'm going to jump off. I have to get on to my next call, but thank you. Great to see everybody. Good luck with everything.
Thanks so much, Rob. Thanks for joining us. Okay, over to you, David.
Right. Well, it looks like I have just a few minutes, and I'll be brief. I'm having a systems issue sharing my screen. Zoom doesn't want to accept my screen. So let me dive right in and go without the slides and say.
Can actually do you want to try again? I'm just still configuring. Maybe I think I've just given you permissions, or. You want to try again? If it's still not working, then yeah, maybe it's just a weird Zoom thing.
Oh, this is frustrating. Let's see. Give me one second. I apologize. This should do it. Okay, so this should do it. Let's try now. Yeah. Okay. So this is the bit where the commercial sponsor makes a few comments. Not really commercial, but somehow the sponsor. And I think Rob's notion of being better is really the spirit that we want to launch this last bit, which is to introduce the Systems Innovation Hub of New York City. And New York's a big place. I would say it's even bigger in spirit. So if you're somewhere in the world and you identify with New York City, you have a home in our hub. We envision building a place to get better. And we think that systems innovation, systems thinking, systems change, is a place to get better, to pivot from this chaos. It's true that COVID isn't going to leave us, but hopefully let's say the crisis period is going to leave us. And we think that there's a lot of disruption, a lot of opportunities to improve the health of our communities and our world. And so we want to start by learning and coming together and aggregating our knowledge in a community. And we're looking to attract like-minded individuals who share that, who share that passion and that inclination. I would say that, let me quickly introduce the slides are doing funny things, so that's strange. But well, here we are. Here's the team. The animations are a bit of a surprise to me, but you can see, I think all of us are on the call. We're a small but feisty group of diverse disciplines and individuals living mostly on the eastern seaboard between New York City and Boston. So as I said, New York's big in spirit. And I don't know if I think all my colleagues are on the call. We've been talking for some time now, training ourselves, and I would say the doors are now open, if you will, virtually speaking. So we encourage you, or if you know people who you think would benefit or be interested in what we're trying to accomplish, we really invite you to make that known, to put a little bit more meat on the bones. There are three components, three pillars to what we're doing. We're trying to build community. We think that there's an old notion in public health that if the problem is in the community, the solution's in the community. And so we think that is true, that there's a notion of coming together to build and transform. New York is a special place in terms of, well, shall we say, complexity, but again, the problems that we have here are not unique or distinct or indifferent to those that are around the world. The second goal we have is really learning, and I think the event we had today, I hope you see the kind of learning we're trying to bring forward, where we have an expert like Rob really guiding us on the practical aspects of this, and we imagine more and more of that, those types of events, so stay tuned. And then I would say the third component is really getting out into the world and doing stuff. I wouldn't say that we're doing that yet, but we're starting to do that, and we have a lot of interesting ideas. And I think we're growing the confidence that we've got some interesting targets for interventions and for activities. And but this is not a doctrine. We're an inclusive group, and we certainly invite others to come and bring their ideas. That's, I think a very fast tour. During the meeting, I saw how much time I had to have. I deleted plenty of slides, so that's the meat of it. And I think I'll just end and say if there's one or two questions about what we're doing, please, ask that. Otherwise, we've got websites and contact forms and LinkedIn pages and all kinds of ways that you can find us and be in touch. So that's what I got. And thank you all for participating in our inaugural event.
Yay. Thanks a lot for that, David. Yeah, an awesome initiative, great part of the world to be. So hopefully we'll get plenty of interest and responses. And as we say, it's a very kind of, these hubs are very kind of loose, informal groups of kind of, so everyone's welcome and do reach out. So yeah, on that note, thanks so much for joining, everyone. Thanks to the co-hosts as well for helping out, and have a great time wherever you are in the world. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.